So welcome back to the channel. So in this video, I'm going to talk about Putin's war of delusions, namely, of course, his ongoing war in Ukraine, which has been going on for coming up for 6 weeks now. So it was based on a number of misapprehensions. Well, what were these fallacious beliefs? First of all, that Ukrainians are Russian. Maybe second of all, that the Ukrainians therefore wouldn't fight. Third of all, that only a handful of fascists in Ukraine rejected the idea of being subjugated by Russia. Fourth of all, that NATO countries wouldn't arm Ukraine. Maybe fifth of all, that there would be no serious sanctions. Sixth of all, related to some of the earlier points, that this conquest could be completed very quickly, and there might be a few other related ones. So Putin published this essay last year on the historical unity of the Russian and Ukrainian peoples. Did he really write it himself? It might have been his favourite ultra-nationalist historian who wrote it for him, who was a histortionist more than a historian, and notably during the opening a round of negotiations between Ukraine and Belarus, only days into the war, who did Putin send as his personal representative? He sent that self-same historian, presumably to harangue the Ukrainians and tell them they weren't Ukrainian at all. Now, I know that Ukrainians and Russians are often kith and kin, but that doesn't mean exactly that they're a section of the Russian nation. I mean, they've had a distinct history as a separate nation for centuries, even though there's some commonalities between Russians and Ukrainians. Anyway, so even if they were part of the Russian nation, they're not anymore. And that's another important point, is the nations are not eternal. They are temporary. And not only are they limited temporarily, obviously they're limited geographically, and they're forever changing. And they're nations which have long since been lost to remembrance, and the nations we haven't even conceived of, which will yet be born. Yeah, he was fixated on that one. Anyway, and what else? That they wouldn't fight. Well, he was dead wrong about that, because they refused to bow down. It was meant to have an intimidatory effect, this build-up of 200,000 troops on their frontier for a couple of months, but they weren't willing to give an inch. Now, Zelensky has importantly said that he would contemplate a neutral Ukraine and never joining NATO. Now, he's therefore giving away something he didn't have to give anyway, because there was no prospect of NATO admitting Ukraine in the medium term even, because whilst the Russians were occupying Luhansk and Donbass and Crimea, NATO wasn't going to let Ukraine in, because that could be the Third World War. When Ukraine say, well, there's a shot being fired from there that's fired by Russia, you have to defend us, Article 5. Otherwise, Article 5 is a dead letter, because if Russia can get away with attacking one NATO state, it'll attack another and another and another. That's what they do, is they'll test your resolve. They'll break the bounds by an inch, and then another and another and another, and see how much they can get away with, all the time lying and saying they're not breaking it at all. In fact, you're aggressing them. So where does he get this idea that any Ukrainians who do not want to be annexed by Russia are fascists? Those who actually want democracy and human rights are fascists, according to Putin. Well, it's true that in the Second World War, some Ukrainian ultra-nationalists, they made common cause with the Third Reich, because they would team up with anyone in order to achieve their goals. Some of them might be genuinely fascist themselves, others not really, just want Ukrainian independence. In dire straits, they will do that. I mean, desperate times call for desperate measures. All right, Indian nationalists, they took the side of Adolf Hitler. That doesn't mean that India is not a legitimate country. Of course, it's a perfectly legitimate country. I don't know, that was a minority viewpoint at the time in India. So it doesn't delegitimize an extant nation. I mean, Romania, Bulgaria, Croatia, arguably Slovakia and so on, they were all on the Axis side, which doesn't mean they're not proper countries. And Putin conveniently forgets that obviously that the Soviet Union was a co-belligerent of the Third Reich in 1939 against Poland, was actively assisting the Third Reich, propagandizing for the Third Reich, giving them a naval base off the Barents Sea and so forth, and evading the Royal Naval blockade by trading over land with the Third Reich. So really expedited the Third Reich's aggression in Western Europe. So because Stepan Bandera, this Ukrainian nationalist, that he formed an alliance with the Third Reich, therefore the Soviet government and now the Russian government have tried to brand any Ukrainian who doesn't want to be conquered by Russia as a banderista. Stepan Bandera, who escaped to Germany, was in Munich after the Second World War, was assassinated in the late 1950s by a Soviet assassin sent to kill him with some poison. Anyway, so Putin, because of his unacceptance of Ukraine's sovereignty, that's why he's managed to trick himself into believing that Ukrainians really want to be part of Russia. And there were some Ukrainians who did, but they overwhelmingly live either in Luhansk, Donbass, or Crimea. and often they're Russian speaking. But there are Ukrainians who are totally Russian speaking, even ethnic Ukrainian, who do not want to be part of Russia. I know some of them, those who cannot speak Ukrainian, but nevertheless they are Ukrainian and don't wish to be part of Russia because a language is just that. It's not a nationality. Now, had he succeeded quite quickly, maybe he would have been right presenting the West with a fait accompli, who would have just shrugged it off and say, well, it's too late to do anything about it now. I mean, I think there would have been some sanctions, maybe not as severe as they are now, believing that it wouldn't actually achieve anything, introducing severe sanctions. So he didn't take account the fact the way the Ukrainian army is much better armed, much better trained, and much better officered than it was 8 years ago. Moreover, they're not fighting for a limited area of territory; they're fighting for the whole country, which is under threat because Putin wants to wipe them off the map. Up until this time, of course, Putin, he was a rational actor, even if we didn't always admit it. His goals were limited. He was circumspect. He was waited the propitious moment. Then he moved quickly and decisively, and all the rest of it. Careful not to push the West too far and provoke swinging sanctions. Well, the severe sanctions have come in. So people couldn't speak truth to power. Those who were dissembling in that notorious National Security Committee meeting on the 22nd of February this year had themselves called out, submitted to a tongue lashing by Putin, and then they all cowered and said that they wholeheartedly concurred with his ingenious plan. But his master plan has gang awry because it was over ambitious in scale and in scope. And obviously, the Western pushback in terms of sanctions, in terms of arming the Ukrainians, has been much more serious than he foresaw. So this is why he's deluded himself, thinking the Russian army was up to much, and he refused to be told the truth. And obviously, a wise leader needs to be willing to listen to unwelcome news, to be told the truth, whether it's attractive or unattractive, rather than childishly disbelieving things or a bit of the Semmelweis reflex. If this is new information which disconfirms my preconceived belief, well, that new information must be bogus. So that's one of his cognitive weaknesses there, which is really playing havoc with the war plans and why they're doing so badly. Anyway, so Ukrainians are so Russian that the Russian army is committing atrocities against them repeatedly. Just recently, the town of Bucha, 20 civilian corpses found shot dead, and appears to be not collateral damage, not a case of mistaken identity or anything like that. I realise with bullets flying in all directions, inevitably the wrong people are going to get killed sometimes, and there are blue on blue incidents. This appears not to be that at all. Willfully slaughtering civilians, knowing them to be civilians and not any threat whatsoever. So that's a war crime in anybody's book, as well as deliberately targeting clinics, hospitals, bomb shelters, and on. Humanitarian convoys. So it really is disgraceful. The use of phosphorus in very built-up areas, the use of cluster bombs. Now, admittedly, Ukraine hasn't signed the convention agreeing not to use cluster bombs either, and it's possible the Ukrainians have used those too. Are there any war crimes by the Ukrainians? In the interest of fairness, even consider this. Some say, well, actually showing Russian prisoners of war on TV, that is one. But I mean, that's obviously trifling compared to the multiple huge-scale war crimes that Putin's forces have committed. So yeah, there was said to be some progress in peace talks, but I don't see it. I mean, Putin's going to fight this war until he thinks, well, the only way to make him stop, really, if he doesn't win, is thinking that continuing it means he might lose power. So if there were massive demonstrations at home, huge-scale unrest, then he might have to back down, sort of 1905, recall the troops to clamp down at home and just give up Ukraine. If you can have something to show for all the sacrifices, like Donbass and Luhansk, that might be enough. That might be a face-saving way out for him. Anyway, so thank you so much for watching my channel. Oh yeah, and I just thought about the imbecility of some of the Russian armed forces at Chernobyl, the site of that terrible 1986 nuclear disaster, some of them digging in, as in digging down trenches into the soil. Now, I'm no scientist, but even I know that's moronic, because that's just releasing radioactive dust, which has a severe effect on some of those troops. Okay, thank you for watching, so please donate with the greatest possible liberality to me on PayPal, georgecallahan79 at gmail.com. Toodaloo.